Well, you're looking at a still frame image of the sun. We put this special program on it so that the little pinpoint emissions, the sparking we call it, those little dots, they show up better. So when they try to cloud or reduce the illumination on these images to hide those pinpoint emissions, then we use this special program to look at those little dots. Those little dots, specks, they seem to favor one side of the frame, and that's because the actual stream is coming from left to right and from an upward position to a downward position, and those little dots, they show up as specks, little tiny like camera flashes on the white light. Those are pinpoint emissions, places where particles are colliding or electrons are being stripped off of an atom. The result of all that sparking is increased energy in the form of X-rays, gamma, and also extreme ultraviolet and infrared. That heats all the planets in the solar system, including planet Earth. So that is of a concern, and we're waiting for that sparking to decrease. Sorry about that. Now, so we're going to scroll through some of the images of the last few days and look and see what the sun is doing and how active the sun is becoming. We're going to be going into solar max. We'll be there completely probably by 2023, and we hope that these coronal mass ejections push the cosmic rays that cause that sparking. We push them out into the solar system. Now, all those little pinpoint flashes, they come in waves. And anybody measuring extreme ultraviolet on the ground here, especially ultraviolet C, sees that these elevations in energy come in waves as well. Your little arrow swells up to the higher counts and then back down again. So it's coming through in waves, as are the cosmic rays from a brown dwarf called Nemesis Planet X. What else? Nibiru. And the cause of all of our grief here on Earth is and has been these particles, these atoms. The reason they're so, how do I say, they come in as neutral particles. They're not ionized. They have all their electrons, these atoms, most of them. And they lose those electrons when they're energized by the sun. They lose their electrons when they collide, or they lose their electrons when a proton steals it. And so what we see is a complete shift in the chemistry of our solar system. That shift and those chemical changes we have pointed out over and over and over again. Now, if we look into the sky, we see that some of the dimming that we're seeing in the constellations, some of that dimming is starting to go away, which is a good sign. It means there's a lot less background light, a lot less filtering of that light, and the stars, the constellations are allowed to shine through in slightly more luminosity. It's still nothing like it used to be. And I can remember where I'm at, or the elevation I'm at, just walking outside night after night after night after night and just saying, wow, 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 wow. And now I don't say wow because And it seems like half the stars are hidden. And they're hidden by increased particles in front of my eyes, between me and the light. There's also increased brightness in the background black. It's more of a chocolate purple. And so the starlight has too much to compete with to reach my eye. But I've pointed out that Pleiades is becoming a little more visible, a nice small constellation that you can use to judge how dim and how bright the solar system has become. And because of these particles, even a former FEMA employee has said these are causing an extinction. She wants to call it the 6th major extinction. Somebody at Stanford, a couple scientists, say it's the 6th major extinction, but we won't know how major the extinction is until another year or two. However, the elite plan on surviving this extinction. They have underground bunkers. They have seed vaults. They have automatic, how shall I say this? They have intelligence that's artificial intelligence that help them with diagnosis of medical conditions. They have artificial intelligence screening millions and millions of profiles on individuals who they deem as questionable to have around. Are they a hindrance, these individuals, to their goals and to their secrets? Well, never jeopardize a criminal man's secrets, because that criminal man may act criminally. But so as we scroll through some of these ejections, you can see that indeed the sun is becoming more active. And when the sun becomes more active, the background baseline X-rays coming off the sun goes up. Here's the problem. Those background X-rays coming off the sun, when there were 0 sunspots, had increased by a factor of 10. So what would increase your background X-ray radiation? What we now know, it's all these cosmic rays. And the charge exchange of the electrons, and the bumping and changing of directions of the electrons, and the collisions that cause atoms to split or to absorb or to eject, all of those release energy, gamma radiation, sometimes light, sometimes ultraviolet, sometimes infrared. And so we have 0 sunspots. Our X-rays go up by a factor of 10, and now the sunspots are showing up. So you're going to look by 2023, our background X-rays on planet Earth are going to be, are you ready for this, 100 times more concentrated, more frequent, more, how do I say that, more in quantity. Because when the sun goes into solar maximum, it's going to add to that background increase that's there already. Now, where this planet is, we know where it is, because every time we get in certain alignments with it and other bodies, Earth has earthquakes. That's happening now. The X is just a little in closer to the sun than we actually think the planet X is. We think it's out and has already crossed over the orbit of Uranus. But it's as high as we can play it on a cropped image. So as we enter into this alignment, at 90-degree alignment with Jupiter and this planet X, we see earthquake clustering begin. We had 6-pointer off Panama. We had a 6-pointer in the southern portion of the Tonga Trench, We had another 6-pointer up at Tonga itself. This is the trench that is connected to Tonga. And this is the trench that has been very, very active seismically for the past 8-9 months. A lot of big quakes here and a lot of clustering of those quakes. Now, usually when a trench becomes active, you see clusters and aftershocks that extend up and down linear-wise along that trench. But this is not the case. In this trench, we see more of a shotgun pattern, which I associate with volcanic origins to those earthquakes. Yes, there's a 6-pointer in here. And again, some of these occur in the transition zone. Now, a transition zone is where the slope of the floor starts to increase or decrease. It's where the floor meets the slope. The transition zone is where more stress is imparted on a piece of land when there is subsidence. You break off, you create disruptions in that transition zone. Therefore, your earthquake clustering is more associated with a caldera or a basin than the shifting of an entire plate or an entire trench. We look at the United States, we see many new small quakes, especially in the supervolcano regions, which is a symptom of large body alignments. So these cosmic rays are doing crazy things to the weather. We're seeing things that we have never seen before, both in earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, and weather. This image we just showed you, 7 water spouts. Yes, 7 water spouts at the same time. Talk about biblical stuff. So we go to the ACE satellite, our early warning satellite, to look at the particles, and we see half, 3/4 of that graph is not even there. We go to other newer satellites, and we see a very specific change in the way these particles are showing up. The orange line, for example, is density. The yellow line is speed. Whenever you have lower density particles, generally they're traveling faster. And when you see higher densities, they travel slower. That correlation that has forever been with us since we could measure on an instrument density and speed of these cosmic rays, in this case solar rays, they think, solar particles, we've lost that inverse relationship. When the density goes up, the speed can go up, and when the density goes down, the speed goes down. Sometimes that's associated with Earth-directed coronal mass ejections. They're coming at you at high speeds. But if you notice the spacing of these anomalies, where you have a whole day of low density, low speed, then you have a whole day of high density, high speed, then it goes back down again. Now, we're not seeing that kind of mixing. This is indicative of the orientation of the second wind with respect to our spiral wind coming in between these spiral arms, filtering in the cracks created by the spiral arms. We see that the arrival of the secondary particles is periodic and very regular. Well, that indication that we know where this object is, because the arrival of higher density particles corresponds with the orientation of the solar spiral. People are also talking about sunspots, how many sunspots there are. Why do sunspots line up? How come they create a ring around the sun? How come some are magnetic? Well, they're all magnetic. So what our answer has been, and this is we are the only people, I am the only person, and this channel is the only channel that has proposed a known origin for sunspots. These are simply impact points. And when you compare the impact points of Shoemaker-Levy upon the Jupiter atmosphere and the surface of Jupiter, you can see they too leave very similar ring around the planet. So to me, iron asteroids would generate a very high level of magnetism and would create exactly everything we see in the sunspot today. Now, the orientation of, and we know there's a planet X. We know exactly where it is. It's 30 to 40 degrees above the ecliptic. It's headed out in front of Uranus, and it will be crossing over Uranus's orbit if it hasn't already. But when you look at the paths of the long period comets and the long period asteroids and the long period dwarf planets, you begin to see, the further out you get, more of a symmetry to the patterns and the orbits. This is indicative of a repetitive and a very uniform orientation to the orbit of planet X. Planet X's orbit, shown here, is and mapped out by Robert Harrington and 70,000 computers, plotted the orbit of planet X, completely different place, opposite actually of the orbit of planet 9, when other computers put it in the opposite part of the solar system. But the problem is we took into account the perturbations of the planets, the perturbations of the other objects. We took into account many things when coming up with the very first orbit of planet X. Now they excluded all that and hand-picked 6 dwarf planets to come up with a new planet X orbit and position. But the orbit that Harrington had drawn is a previous orbit. It's not the current orbit. So the fact that this shows it leaving Aquarius and we had it coming in through Aquarius is completely accurate. And there are diagrams showing you the subsequent orbital path of planet X. Those have been scrubbed off the internet. It's amazing how quickly a lot of this information has gone and how swiftly it continues to erode. And a diagram that was there a year ago, I now cannot find. But planet X comes back in through the constellation it left in. The reason for that is that it's a long period orbit, 3,600 to 5,000 years. That's a pretty long orbit, way past our lifetimes. And the sun is in motion around the center of our galaxy, makes a complete rotation around the galaxy every 230 million years. So then, when planet X comes back around the sun, it cannot possibly retrace its previous steps. It is virtually impossible. Whereas the short period comets, in 5 years, 10 years type of period, they pretty much repeat their same orbits because the sun has not moved quite as far as it would have in 3,600, 4,000, 5,000 years. So then what you would have is, after 230 million years, this orbital path and the subsequent paths would all end up looking. So now, Nemesis and Planet X are not my terms. Nemesis is NASA's term. Planet X is a professional astronomy term used by Percival Lowell and popularized by Robert Harrington. And Robert Harrington wrote a paper, a small book, called, get this, The Location of Planet X. So, Planet X is not a conspiracy theory. It's a scientific theory based upon scientific facts. And even conspiracy theories all originate from a single fact. All conspiracy theories, right or wrong, originate from a factual basis almost all of them. So then, if you look at a collision scenario and you look at a steep incline, you would see that the further away you got from the sun's gravity, the more diverse your debris field should be, which is why the Kuiper belt is not a disk like the asteroid belt, which is why the Kuiper belt actually has dark spots in it, areas where Jupiter has gathered up the debris. But it also has depth. The Kuiper belt is not just a flat ring like Saturn's rings. The Kuiper belt extends in some places very far above the ecliptic and very far below the ecliptic. So it has depth to its width, and therefore does kind of retain some of the characteristics of a highly inclined object that may have created the debris field called the Kuiper belt. Now, there are many, many things happening in our world today that are, in fact, evidence of a large body, especially a brown dwarf. Brown dwarfs are notorious for containing lithium because brown dwarfs were once red giants, very big, heavy stars in which lithium can be produced. So when the star collapses and does not detonate into a supernova, you have a small high-spinning star that's still partially fusing some of the helium into lithium and beryllium. And so what we've seen is that the lithium spectroscopy, the amount of energy created by ionization of lithium particles near and around the solar corona, has not just increased, but has sharply increased in an accelerated curve. So why would lithium, a sure sign of a brown dwarf, be climbing in an accelerated pattern? Other accelerated patterns are seen on Earth that mimic the accelerated pattern of the lithium spectroscopy wavelength. Other things that have mushroomed and accelerated in a similar acceleration is the number of earthquakes, the amount of volcanism, the amount of extreme ultraviolet, and the amount of regular ultraviolet. Those have shown a remarkable sharp increase. Other things showing a remarkable acceleration in number. That would be the presence of comets within our solar system. A really huge and dramatic increase. What would do that? And the other thing that I have to point out to you is that something is very, very obvious when you have a one-time visitor that only comes through our solar system once, yet passes the sun. So to me, it's if it's in orbit around the sun, if it comes through and by the sun, if it passes anywhere near the sun, it's part of our solar system. But a one-time visitor from interstellar space just happens to show up. Well, that's like what, 1 in a billion year odds? But yet, it's happened twice now in the last 5 years, where an interstellar visitor from outside our solar system enters our solar system. To me, the only reason it entered our solar system is because it's part of our solar system. However, we're just going to go with what NASA says. Why are these one-time visitors showing up with tens of thousands of new found asteroids and thousands of brand new comets? We have short period comets that are new. How do you have a short period comet that's new? It should have been here a few years ago. How do you have a medium range comet that's new? Moderately classified comets that are moderate in terms of duration or orbit. Those are usually called the Jupiter family. How do you get new comets in the Jupiter family? How do all of these comets, long period, one-time visitors, moderate period, and short period? How come all of them have new comets in their grouping system? And how come they're all showing up at the same time? Well, the answer is simple. They were all created, most of these objects, within our own solar system. And that some of these objects will maintain the characteristic orbit of the brown dwarf, which is inclined. And if there had been a collision, the solid objects would maintain the relative pattern, the relative path of the solid object. So if you have a star colliding with a massive icy rocky planet, then the rocky planet on a flat disk will maintain an asteroid belt and a debris field that is more of a disk. Whereas the cometary stuff coming off the brown dwarf would maintain and adhere to and try to maintain and conserve the momentum in the original plane of the brown dwarf. So you would have many, many, many inclined objects. And when you look at the patterns of some of these long period comets, you might say, well, that's a lot of long period comets. But look, the outside of that frame, towards the outer reaches, we see symmetry. We see real symmetry. So much symmetry that we almost see a mosaic pattern that runs consistently in the furthermost reaches, in the outer boundary of the frame of this picture. We see many, many hundreds and hundreds of orbits, but yet we see a pattern that looks symmetrical. So, if in fact these objects were created by the passage of a large brown dwarf through our solar system every 3,600 years, maybe another one every 5,000 years, then when it comes back around the sun would have moved considerably and the orbits would overlap and change their orbits. So that after 230 million years, that's the time it takes for our Earth to pass around the entire solar system. During that time, it should become very apparent that any long period star that's an orbital twin would eventually make its trip around the solar system, following the sun, orbiting the sun, so that each and every orbit can never identically overlap the previous orbit, and giving us a pattern of orbits that is symmetrical and replicable and predictable, which is the case. So until next time, be prepared, not scared.